The claret landed on the white linen like a crime scene. A deep, spreading stain that silenced the low hum of the restaurant for 3 full seconds. Catherine Dabney did not flinch. She simply retracted her hand from the overturned glass of Saint-Emilion, her wrist held at an elegant, accusatory angle, as if the glass itself had betrayed her. Her gaze, a precise shade of Arctic blue, swept past the offending puddle and fixed on the maitre d' across the room. She did not need to raise her voice. Her disappointment was a broadcast signal. Her fiancé, Ichiro Sato, did not move. He watched the wine bleed into the cloth, his expression as placid as the surface of a dark lake. His stillness was a language of its own, far more potent than Catherine's theatrical discontent. He was a man made of careful silences. His suit was a whisper of charcoal silk, his hands rested on the table, one over the other, a study in composure. He was observing everything. The way the other diners pretended not to watch, the slight stiffening of the maitre d's spine, the slow, inevitable journey of a waitress now approaching their table. Her name was Lena. She moved with an economy of motion that suggested a life of discipline. No wasted steps, no hurried gestures. Her uniform was immaculate, a crisp black and white that seemed less a costume than a statement of intent. She arrived at the table not with an apology, but with a quiet presence. She held a folded white cloth in her hand. "You," Catherine said. The word was not a summons. It was a verdict. "Clean this up." Lena's eyes met Catherine's. They were a warm, intelligent brown, and they held no trace of fear or deference. They simply registered the command. For a moment, she did not move. The pause was infinitesimal to most, but to Ichiro, it lasted for years. It was a space in which a decision was being made. Lena's gaze drifted from Catherine to the spilled wine, then to Ichiro. He offered nothing. This was not his stage. Finally, Lena looked back at the blonde woman. Her voice, when it came, was low and clear, carrying no more than the necessary distance to their table. "You spilled it." Catherine's perfectly sculpted lips parted. A small, sharp intake of breath. The statement was so absurdly simple, so profoundly insubordinate, that it took a moment to register as reality. Men at the next table paused their conversation, forks hovering over their plates. "Excuse me?" Catherine's voice was a sliver of ice. "I believe the expectation is that you would use your own napkin for a spill of your own making," Lena said, her tone unchanged. She was not angry. She was not sarcastic. She was stating a fact, as if explaining the rules of a game to a child. "Or, if you require assistance, the word is please." Ichiro shifted, a micro-movement of his shoulders. His eyes, dark and analytical, were now fixed entirely on Lena. He had seen bravado. He had seen foolishness. This was neither. This was something else. Something prepared. Catherine's face, which had been a mask of bored entitlement, was now flushed with a furious, mottled red. Her beauty seemed to curdle in the face of such calm opposition. "Do you have any idea who he is?" She gestured with a dismissive flick of her fingers toward Ichiro. "Do you know who I am?" Lena held her gaze. The folded cloth in her hand remained, unused. Her posture was perfect. She seemed to grow taller in the silence. "I know who I am," Lena replied, her voice dropping even lower, becoming a quiet force that reshaped the air around them. "The more important question, the one you should be asking yourself right now, is who do you think you are?" The question hung in the air, stripped of rhetoric. It was a genuine inquiry. It was a scalpel. Catherine stared, speechless, her mouth opening and closing silently. The carefully constructed world of her own importance had just been dismantled by a waitress holding a piece of cloth. And beside her, Ichiro Sato, for the first time all evening, allowed the barest hint of something other than placid observation to touch his lips. It was not a smile. It was the recognition of an opening move in a game he had not known he was playing. Catherine did not recover. The insult was too fundamental, too precisely delivered. Her fury, which had been a sharp, focused point, now became a sputtering, directionless fire. Get her fired. She hissed at Ichiro, her voice a ragged whisper.
Right now.
I want her gone. Ichiro did not look at her. His attention remained on Lena, who was now calmly placing a fresh napkin over the wine stain, a temporary solution that was both functional and a quiet dismissal of the drama. She worked with the unhurried grace of someone who had already calculated every possible outcome and was content with any of them. Takeda, Ichiro said, his voice soft. From a discreet table near the entrance, a man in a dark suit rose without a sound and approached. Takeda was Ichiro's shadow, a man whose loyalty was as much a part of him as his own bones. He stood beside the table, his presence creating an immediate perimeter of privacy. Sir, Takeda said. See to it that our waitress is not disturbed for the remainder of her shift, Ichiro instructed. He then turned his head slightly, finally acknowledging his fiancée. We are leaving, Catherine. Leaving? I'm not leaving until she is thrown out on the street. We are leaving, Ichiro repeated. The words were identical, but the tone had cooled by 20 degrees. It was not a suggestion. He placed his own napkin on the table and rose. Takeda pulled back his chair. The movement was so fluid it was almost invisible. Catherine, caught between her outrage and his authority, had no choice. She stood, her chair scraping against the floor, a single, graceless sound in the restored quiet of the restaurant. As they walked away, Ichiro paused beside Takeda. Find out everything about her, he said, his voice too low for Catherine to hear. Her name, where she lives, who her family was. I want to know why she was not afraid. Yes, sir. Lena, for her part, did not watch them go. She collected the soiled glass and the damp, stained linen, her expression serene. She had lit a fuse. Now, all she had to do was wait. The rest of her shift passed in a state of suspended reality. Her colleagues gave her a wide berth, their expressions a mixture of awe and terror. Mr. Dubois, the maitre d', an older gentleman with the weary eyes of a man who had seen generations of wealth and power dine in his establishment, simply gave her a slow, deliberate nod as she passed the host's stand. It was a gesture of solidarity, or perhaps of understanding. At 2 a.m, Lena walked home through the quiet streets of the city. The air was cool against her skin. She did not feel the thrill of victory or the cold dread of consequence. She felt only the deep, resonant calm of a promise taking its first breath. For 22 years, this moment had been a distant point on a map drawn by others. Now she was here. She unlocked the door to her small, meticulously clean apartment. On a small table by the window sat a single, framed photograph, a smiling, handsome black man standing next to a proud, serious-looking Japanese man. They stood before the facade of this very same restaurant, decades ago. Lena picked it up, her fingers tracing the image of her grandfather. This was not about a spilled glass of wine. It had never been. It was about a debt. An old and patient one. And the time to collect had finally arrived. Takeda was ruthlessly efficient. Information flowed to him through channels that did not appear on any organizational chart. By dawn, a preliminary file was on Ichiro's desk in the penthouse that overlooked the sleeping city. The file was thin. Lena Walker, age 28. No criminal record. Excellent employee reviews. Graduated from a state university with a degree in history. Lived alone. Parents deceased. On the surface, she was nobody. An ordinary woman who had committed an extraordinary act of social suicide. But Takeda was paid to see beneath surfaces. He had flagged 2 details. First, the apartment she lived in was owned by a holding company with ties to his own organization, the Sadogumi, dating back 40 years. It had been paid in full since 1983. Second, there was a 7-year gap in her life between the ages of 16 and 23. Sealed juvenile records, and then nothing. No school, no work, no digital footprint. She had simply vanished, only to reappear as a university student with a quiet, unremarkable history. Ichiro read the file in the gray morning light, a cup of green tea steaming at his elbow. Catherine was asleep in another wing of the apartment, sedated by her own indignation. He felt a familiar sense of distance from her, from the world of loud, fragile egos she represented. He was more interested in the quiet woman with the 7-year silence. He walked to his father's study, a room preserved exactly as it had been on the day he died. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and leather. He ran his hand along the dark, polished wood of the desk. He did not need a key for the bottom left drawer. He knew the sequence of pressures that would open the hidden lock. Inside, beneath neatly bundled land deeds and investment portfolios, was a small, lacquered box. He lifted the lid. It contained a single photograph and a folded piece of rice paper. The photograph was the same one that sat on Lena's table. His own father, Kenshin Sato, looking younger and less burdened, his arm around a broadly smiling black man. On the back, in his father's elegant script, were 2 names, Sato Kenshin, Samuel Walker. Below that, a single line, "A debt of honor is a debt for life." He had seen the photograph before, but had never known the story. He unfolded the rice paper. It was a letter, a promise. It spoke of a night of fire and betrayal, of a life saved, of a loyalty that transcended race and business. It spoke of Samuel Walker, a man who had been his father's first and truest friend in America, a man who had stood with him when his own people had turned against him. The letter ended with a vow that the Sato family would forever be indebted to the Walker family, and that if a day ever came when a Walker needed protection, sanctuary, or justice, the full weight of the Sato-gumi would be at their disposal. It was signed with his father's blood-red seal. The file on his desk now made a terrifying kind of sense. Lena Walker was not a waitress. She was the inheritor of a sacred vow. Her act at the restaurant was not defiance. It was a summons. She had not been disrespectful to his fiancé. She had been testing him. She had been asking, without words, if the son was the same as the father. If honor still had a place in his world. Meanwhile, after her shift, Lena did not go straight home. She went to the restaurant's back office, where Mr. Dubois was waiting for her. He poured 2 small glasses of brandy. "It has begun," he said, his voice quiet. He had been the head maitre d' for 35 years. He remembered Samuel Walker. He had been a busboy when Kenshin Sato and Samuel Walker had made the restaurant their unofficial headquarters. "He knows," Lena said. It was not a question. "A man like Ichiro Sato will know by sunrise," Mr. Dubois confirmed. "His father's memory is the one thing he holds sacred." He slid a small, heavy iron key across the desk. "Your grandfather wanted you to have this. When the time was right. It opens a storage unit on the west side. He said what's inside would explain the rest." Lena took the key. Its cold weight felt like history itself in her palm. "Thank you, Jean-Pierre." "Your grandfather was a good man," the maitre d' said, looking into his glass. "He saved more than just Kenshin Sato's life that night. He saved the soul of this place." He looked up, his old eyes sharp. "Be careful. The Sato-gumi is not what it was. The old honor is being challenged by a new greed." Lena nodded, pocketing the key. She understood. Her grandfather had not just left her a claim on a debt. He had left her a role in a war she was only just beginning to understand. The report Takeda delivered at 9 a.m. and was brief and verbal. He stood before Ichiro's desk, a living statue of competence. "Her name is Lena Walker. Her grandfather was Samuel Walker." Ichiro looked up from the lacquered box, which now sat open before him. "I know." Takeda's composure did not flicker, but there was a new depth of understanding in his eyes. He had served the father before the son. He knew the name Samuel Walker. The name was a legend within the oldest circles of the organization, a story of loyalty from a time before spreadsheets and offshore accounts. "Her parents died in a car accident when she was 16, Takeda continued. "A rival family targeted her. Your father intervened. He invoked the promise. He hid her. For 7 years, she was raised and trained in a private facility in Hokkaido, under the protection of the old guard. She was taught our language, our customs, our code. She was trained to see, to listen, to survive. When your father passed, the protection became less certain. The new elements in the organization saw the debt as a liability. She was sent back here, to wait. Ichiro absorbed the information. The pieces locked into place with the cold, satisfying click of a well-made machine. Lena Walker was not just a claimant. She was a weapon forged by his own father. She had been hidden in plain sight, a living testament to an old promise, waiting for the moment to reveal herself. The dinner, the spilled wine. It was a perfectly calibrated piece of theater designed to get his and only his attention. It was an insult to Catherine, but it was a message to him, a test of his character. The men who targeted her then, Ichiro said, they are the same ones who now challenge the old ways. It is likely, sir, Takeda confirmed. They would see the honoring of this debt as a weakness, a sentimentality we can no longer afford. Ichiro closed the box. The decision had already been made. It had been made for him 40 years ago, in a fire, by his father. Arrange a meeting. With her. Not here. Somewhere neutral. The Oak Room at the Carlisle. Tonight. 9 o'clock. And Miss Dabney? Takeda asked. Miss Dabney will have a prior engagement, Ichiro said, his voice flat. He looked out the window at the sprawling city. It was his territory, his inheritance. But it was built on a foundation of promises. If those promises were broken, the entire structure would collapse into dust. Lena Walker was not a threat to his world. She was the key to preserving it. The summons came via Mr. Dubois. A simple message. A table has been reserved. Lena understood immediately. She spent the day not in anxious preparation, but in quiet focus. She visited the storage unit. It was a small, climate-controlled space. Inside was a single wooden chest. It contained not weapons or money, but journals. Her grandfather's journals, written in his neat, strong hand. For hours, she sat on the cold concrete floor and read. She read about his friendship with Kenshin Sato, about the birth of the organization, about the slow poisoning of its principles by men who valued profit over people. He had seen this day coming. He had been preparing her for it her entire life. Her 7 years in Japan were not just for her protection. They were her education. She was raised to understand both worlds, to be a bridge between them. Her grandfather had not left her a fortune. He had left her a purpose. That evening, she chose a simple, elegant black dress. It was the uniform of the restaurant, but stripped of its servitude. It was now a uniform of quiet authority. She arrived at the Carlisle at precisely 9 o'clock. A maitre d', different from Dubois but cut from the same cloth of professional discretion, led her not to the main dining room but to a private, wood-paneled study, the Oak Room. Ichiro was already there, standing by a window overlooking the park. Takeda stood by the door, a silent guardian. The room held only a small table with 2 chairs and a bottle of ridiculously expensive whiskey. Miss Walker, Ichiro said, turning from the window. He gestured to the chair. Please. She sat. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light. He pushed one across the table to her. My father taught me that the most important conversations should happen over the oldest whiskey, he said. It was the beginning of a new protocol. They were no longer boss and waitress. They were equals at this table. My grandfather taught me to let the other person speak first, Lena replied, her hands resting in her lap. Ichiro allowed a brief, thin smile. He was a wise man. He sat opposite her, the table between them feeling less like a barrier and more like a board for the game they were about to play. You have my attention. The question my fiancé asked you last night was the wrong one. The right one is this. What do you want? Lena met his gaze without hesitation. She did not touch her glass. Want is the wrong word. What I am doing is calling in a debt. A promise made between 2 men who understood the meaning of the word. The promise, Ichiro said, his voice a low murmur. I read it this morning. It is a matter of honor. Honor is the only currency that matters in the end, she said, quoting a line from her grandfather's journal. A line he had attributed to Kenshin Sato. Ichiro's eyes registered the quote. He nodded slowly. And what does the honor of my house require? Protection, Lena said simply. There is a man, an old friend of your father's and my grandfather's. His name is Mr. Abe. He was your father's chief advisor, the architect of his legitimate businesses. He represents the old way. The new men in your organization, the ones who value money more than loyalty, they see him as an obstacle. They plan to remove him. Ichiro's face remained a mask, but a muscle in his jaw tightened. He knew of Abe. The old man had retired shortly after his father's death, vanishing from the world of the Sadogumi. He was a living library of its history, its secrets, its soul. To kill him would be to kill the past. Why him? Why now? Ichiro asked. Because they are making a move for control, Lena explained. They are negotiating a deal. Arms trafficking with a cartel your father refused to do business with. Abe is the only one left alive who can veto it on grounds of your father's code. His death would be symbolic. It would signal the end of the Kenshin era and the beginning of their own. And your grandfather knew this would happen. He saw the seeds of it 20 years ago, Lena confirmed. He made me the keeper of the promise. My purpose is to ensure Mr. Abe is safe, and that the honor of the Sado name is not broken on your watch. Ichiro leaned back in his chair, swirling the whiskey in his glass. He was being asked to start a war within his own house, on the word of a woman he had met less than 24 hours ago. A woman who had been trained by his own father to do exactly this. It was a test, a legacy, and a trap, all in one. He looked at her, at the unwavering calm in her eyes. She was not asking for a favor. She was reminding him of his duty. My father was a better judge of character than I am, Ichiro said finally. And he judged your family to be worth his life. That is enough for me, he raised his glass. To promises kept. Lena picked up her own glass, her fingers closing around it. To promises kept, she echoed. The alliance was sealed. Not with a handshake, but with the clink of crystal and the weight of 2 generations of honor. Catherine, meanwhile, was not having a prior engagement. She was stewing in a self-imposed exile within the penthouse. Ichiro's cold dismissal had been more unnerving than any argument. It was a sign that her currency, her beauty, her social standing, her connection to him, was being devalued. She was not a stupid woman. She was a deeply entitled one, and entitlement is a kind of blindness. But when threatened, the blind can develop other senses. She made a call, not to one of her society friends, but to a man her father used, a private investigator who specialized in the kind of dirt that clung to the wealthy. She didn't want to know who the waitress was. She wanted to know why Ichiro was protecting her, why a public humiliation had resulted in a private meeting. The information that came back was fragmented but terrifying. Whispers of an old debt. The name Abe. Talk of a schism within the Sadogumi, led by a ruthless younger captain named Ozaki. Ozaki was one of the men who had been most charming to her, who had treated her like a queen. She now understood that his deference was a tool. He saw her as what she was, an American decoration, a useful but ultimately disposable part of Ichiro's life. He and his faction assumed Ichiro was weak, sentimental, softened by Western habits. They saw Catherine as proof of that weakness. The realization was a cold shock. Her anger at Lena, the waitress, dissolved, replaced by a more primal fear. She was a pawn in a game she hadn't known existed. Her humiliation at the restaurant wasn't just about her. It was a public test of Ichiro, and his response, protecting the waitress, had been read by his enemies as confirmation of his weakness. They would be moving now, moving against Ichiro, through this old man, Abe. Her loyalty was not to Ichiro's honor. It was to her own survival. But for the first time, their interests were perfectly aligned. She found a burner phone Takeda had once given her for emergencies. Her fingers trembled slightly as she dialed Ichiro's private number. He answered on the first ring. He was still with Lena. What is it, Catherine? His voice was cold, impatient. It's Ozaki, she said, her own voice tight with fear. He thinks you're weak. He's using me, using the dinner, as an excuse. They're going after some old man tonight. Abe. They said they're going to his sanctuary. A bookstore in the old quarter. They're moving right now. There was a silence on the other end of the line. It was not the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of calculation. How do you know this? Ichiro asked. Because I'm not as stupid as they think I am, she snapped back, a flash of her old fire returning, now repurposed. And I have no intention of ending up as the collateral damage in your family's civil war. She hung up. It was the most useful thing she had ever done. In the oak room, Ichiro lowered the phone. He looked at Lena. Her face was calm, her eyes expectant. Ozaki, he said. He's moving on Abe, tonight. A bookstore in the old quarter. Lena nodded. The place is called Vespers. My grandfather took me there once. He said it was the safest place in the city. Nothing is safe anymore, Ichiro said. He stood up, pushing his chair back. Takeda was already at the door, his hand inside his jacket. The slow burn was over. The pace had just accelerated to the speed of survival. Takeda, the car. No security detail. Just us. We go now. The city streaked past the windows of the black sedan, a blur of neon and shadow. The car moved through traffic with an unnatural fluidity, Takeda at the wheel. There was no siren, but they seemed to part the sea of cars before them. In the back, Ichiro and Lena sat in a charged silence. The air was thick with unspoken history and imminent violence. This was the culmination of a 40-year-old promise, a race against a betrayal that had been festering for just as long. Ozaki is young, ambitious, Ichiro said, his voice a low rumble against the hum of the engine. He sees my father's code not as a strength, but as a cage. He wants the profits of the cartels, the reach of the human traffickers. He believes honor is a commodity to be sold. My grandfather called it a sickness, Lena replied, her gaze fixed on the passing streets. The forgetting of origins. He said a man who doesn't know where he comes from can't be trusted to know where he's going. Ichiro glanced at her profile in the dim light. She was not afraid. She was focused, a stillness in the heart of the storm. She had been preparing for this her entire life. He, on the other hand, had been running from it. He had managed his father's empire, expanded its legitimate fronts, and treated the darker elements as a distasteful inheritance to be contained. He had never faced a direct challenge to its soul. Not until now. Takeda took a sharp left, turning into a narrow, cobblestone street. The old quarter. The buildings leaned in on themselves, heavy with age and secrets. He killed the headlights, coasting the last 100 feet. 2 men at the entrance, Takeda reported, his eyes scanning the street. Another 2 across in the alley. Amateurs. They're expecting an old man, not us. We go in the back, Ichiro decided. Lena, you stay with Takeda. No, she said, her voice firm. I am the living proof of the debt. My presence is not negotiable. They need to see me. They need to see you honoring the promise. It's the only way this ends without a war. Ichiro studied her for a long moment. She was right. This was not a battle of bullets. It was a battle of legitimacy. His authority rested on the code Ozaki sought to destroy. To win, he had to embody it. Stay behind me, was all he said. They slipped out of the car and into the shadows of a back alley. The air smelled of damp brick and rain. Takeda moved ahead, a ghost in the darkness. He disabled the single camera above the rear entrance with a quiet, efficient twist of a small tool. He picked the lock in under 10 seconds. The door opened with a soft click. They entered into a cavern of books. The scent of old paper and leather was overwhelming, a library and a tomb all at once. Dim light filtered down from a skylight 2 stories above. Shelves stretched up into the darkness, packed with silent stories. At the center of the large room, in a pool of light from a single green-shaded lamp, sat an old man in a worn leather armchair. It was Mr. Abe. He was reading, a magnifying glass in one hand. He did not look up as they approached. You are late, Ichiro-sen, he said, turning a page. Ozaki's boys have been loitering outside for 20 minutes. Their impatience is vulgar. Before Ichiro could respond, the front door of the shop burst open. Ozaki entered, flanked by 4 of his men. He was young, dressed in a flashy suit, a cruel smile on his face. He saw Ichiro and his smile faltered for a fraction of a second, then hardened. Sato-san, Ozaki said, with a mock bow. I did not expect you. We are simply here to help Mr. Abe with his retirement. Ichiro stepped forward, placing himself between Ozaki and Abe's chair. Takeda melted into the shadows to his right. Lena stepped out from behind Ichiro, moving to his left. She stood in the light, her face calm and resolute. Ozaki's eyes flickered to her. And you brought your new waitress. How sentimental. This is Lena Walker, Ichiro said, his voice resonating in the quiet space. Granddaughter of Samuel Walker. The name landed like a physical blow. The older two of Ozaki's men shifted on their feet, their eyes wide. They knew the stories. They knew what that name meant. Ozaki's face tightened. He had not counted on this. An old story, Ozaki spat. A ghost from a time that is over. This is a new world with new rules. There is only one rule, Ichiro stated, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying more power than a shout. Honor. My father's life was saved by her grandfather. A debt was sworn. That debt is sacred. By moving against Abe-san, you move against a protected friend of the Walker family. You are not breaking a new rule, Ozaki. You are attempting to break the foundation on which this entire organization was built. He took another step forward. You spit on my father's grave. You shame his memory. You shame all of us. He looked past Ozaki, to the men behind him. Do you stand with him? Do you cast your lot with a man who would throw away the very honor that gives us a name? Or do you stand with the son of Kenshin Sato, who has come here tonight to keep his father's promise? It was a coup, executed not with a blade, but with a principle. The men behind Ozaki looked at each other, then at the floor. They saw Ichiro, calm and powerful. They saw Takeda, a lethal shadow ready to act. And they saw Lena, a black woman in a simple dress who is somehow the most powerful person in the room, the living embodiment of their history. The foundation. Ozaki saw his support evaporate. His rage and humiliation curdled on his face. He reached for the gun inside his jacket. He never cleared the leather. Takeda moved with impossible speed, a blur from the shadows. There was a sharp, precise series of sounds, a wrist breaking, a knee buckling. Ozaki crumpled to the floor, screaming. Takeda stood over him, impassive. The other men did not move. They looked at Ichiro, their faces a mixture of fear and a strange, rediscovered respect. The war was over. Mr. Abe closed his book. Well, he said to the silence. That was long overdue. In the quiet aftermath, Ozaki and his men were removed by Takeda's discreet team. They vanished into the night, their futures now a matter of internal justice. Mr. Abe made tea, his hands steady. The bookstore was a sanctuary once more. He handed a cup to Lena, his eyes filled with a deep, paternal warmth. Your grandfather would be so proud, child, he said softly. You have his courage. And his timing. I just did what I was taught, Lena replied, accepting the cup. Ichiro stood by the window, looking out at the now empty street. He had not just defeated a rival. He had claimed his own legacy. He had been forced to become the man his father had always believed he could be. He turned and looked at Lena, who was speaking quietly with Abe. She was not a complication. She was a compass. She had pointed him back to true north. Later, as dawn threatened to break across the city, he stood with her on the penthouse balcony. The air was clean and cold. The city below was a tapestry of sleeping lights. My father's promise is fulfilled, Ichiro said. Abe is safe. The debt is paid. But my organization is now in your debt. You reminded us of who we are supposed to be, he paused. There is a place for you here, not as a waitress. As an advisor. A counsel. You understand the code better than men who have been in my family for generations. Lena looked out at the horizon, a thin line of gray and gold. My grandfather didn't want me to join your world. He wanted me to make sure it didn't lose its soul. Then help me, Ichiro said. It was not a command. It was a plea. Help me ensure it does not. A small, rare smile touched Lena's lips. It was the first genuine expression of relief she had allowed herself. The pay had better be good, she said, her tone dry. I'm leaving a very promising career in hospitality. Ichiro found himself smiling in return. A real smile. It felt foreign and familiar all at once. The tension of the last 48 hours of his entire life seemed to finally recede. A promise made in fire and blood decades ago had been honored in a quiet bookstore. A generational weight had been lifted, not by forgetting the past, but by finally, fully embracing it. The sun was rising, and for the first time, he felt ready to meet the day. He was no longer just the heir. He was the keeper of the code. And he would not be keeping it alone.